Good evening, Tristan, and thank you very much for joining me on the Sami Parvez show. It's a great pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure, sir, and it has been a long time. I've been looking that you join me on the Sami Parvez show. Finally, you made it.
Yes, I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. So you recently published your new book, "Don't Be Canada: How One Country Did Everything Wrong All at Once." We will talk about your book and congratulations on launching your book. Is it your first book?
It is, yes. All
Mm-hmm.
my other book ideas were not marketable, so this is the only one that was.
Okay, yeah, we will talk about your book at the end, but let's talk about as we were talking before off the camera that there is lots of conspiracy theories are going on in Canada, particularly as there were lots of concern about like Justin Trudeau is the son of Fidel Castro, what Trump also called out. So, what's your take on it?
This is what when we're promoting the book. So my marketing manager, the marketing manager works for the publisher. She said, "Well, when I'm shopping you around as someone who can talk about the book, what else can you talk about?" And I said, "Well, I happen to be, you know, the leading expert in the theory that Justin Trudeau is Fidel Castro's son."
Mm-hmm.
Which, if people are tuning out, it's not true. I don't think he's Fidel Castro's son, but I'm probably the only reporter who's actually got into the nitty gritty of why, because he really, really looks like Fidel Castro. You've probably seen the pictures
Yep.
on the internet, and a young Fidel Castro without the beard looks very similar to Justin Trudeau. Now, a lot of people look similar, but there also was a close familiar relationship between Fidel Castro and the Trudeau family, including Trudeau's mom. So, those two pieces of information, it sounds plausible that Justin Trudeau actually looks more like Fidel Castro, I would argue, than his own father. So, you can look at those two pieces of information. So, I've broken down the actual dates of when the Trudeaus met the Castros, when Justin was born, and the timelines don't line up. So anyway, if you need specifics on why it didn't happen, basically, Justin Trudeau was almost certainly, if we want to get into these details, he was almost certainly conceived on his parents' honeymoon. Now, people always point to me, they say, well, the honeymoon was in the Caribbean. And they went to this mysterious Caribbean island at some point. There's actually a press account from that time. Pierre Trudeau and his new bride, take side trip. I think they were. What's one of the islands at the complete eastern end of the Caribbean? I think it was maybe the Bahamas or something. And they said, "Well, that's your evidence." They went to Cuba, and then she was secretly impregnated
Mm-hmm.
by Fidel Castro. But I mean, if you look, Cuba is at the complete other end of the Caribbean. So it's the equivalent of flying from Toronto to Winnipeg. It's quite far. I didn't know how big the Caribbean was. So the only way this makes sense is, and they didn't know, Trudeau didn't know Castro at the time. They would actually form a relationship after Justin was already born. So when you see the picture of Fidel actually holding a baby, that's not Justin. That's his younger brother,
Yep.
who was eventually killed in an avalanche
Mm-hmm.
later. But anyway, the only way this theory makes sense is if you take Margaret Trudeau, who was quite young when she married Pierre Trudeau, and she goes on her honeymoon, and then Pierre takes her on like a secret flight all the way across the Caribbean, like a 4-hour flight. They get off at the airport. There's Fidel Castro, this like communist dictator. He impregnates her within like 90 minutes, and then they get back on the plane, and then they fly another 4 hours across the Caribbean. Not a lot of time to so the only way it works is if there's this conspiracy to impregnate the prime minister's wife by a communist dictator that neither of them had met before. So it stops making sense in that sense. So anyway, but they do really, really look similar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it seems like these conspiracy theories are getting like spreading like a wildfire. Is it because of this digital media or social media age, or is it more common in Canada?
uh, I think, yeah, conspiracy theories, it's one of those things where we try and we often sort of we're hard on the internet for it. So we're like, oh, the internet allows these conspiracy theories to sort of spread. I do a lot of reading about the past, and they had no problem getting conspiracy theories flying around in the past. So I would almost be inclined to say, if you take your average Canadian 100 years ago, they've just got a radio set, they're living on the prairies, and you pick all the nutty things they believe, and you compare them to the nutty things that a modern Canadian believes, I'm not convinced that the modern Canadian is nuttier than the 100-year-old Canadian. So, yes, conspiracy theories do spread online. This one particularly does, because, again, I can't stress this enough. Fidel Castro really looks like Justin Trudeau. I mean,
Yep.
it's there is precedent. The first Prime Minister of Canada, Johnny MacDonald, looked exactly like, I'm forgetting his name, Benjamin Disraeli, a Prime Minister of the UK, to the point where when MacDonald was in the UK to negotiate the terms of Confederation, people kept thinking he was Disraeli. That's how similar they looked. So, on the very specific issue of prime ministers of Canada looking like other world leaders, there's precedent to that. So, yeah, I don't begrudge anybody who has no, details of the, if you just saw how similar they looked, and then you see, I mean, Margaret Trudeau wrote in her autobiography she wrote about her attraction to Fidel Castro. So this idea that she could be seduced by Fidel Castro, even that's not much of a stretch. So yes, it's a super plausible theory up to 75%, and then it's in the details when I think it sort of falls apart. None of which is discussed in the book, I should add, but
Yeah.
this is one of the many expertise that I can offer to the Sami Parvez show.
Thank you, sir. And as you are talking about Justin Trudeau, you brought up like we are discussing him. But I need to ask you, like the legacy of Trudeau, like Justin Trudeau, how would you see it? And like, did he destroy Canada? Like some people say that. Do you agree with that?
This kind of checks into the book. So the book it's just about my observation that on a number of things, Canada has gotten worse than anybody else. So there's a number of things we do badly, but other countries also do it quite badly. But we took some issues and we went further than anyone else, and I would argue screwed them up the most. So like a great example is we are bottom of the OECD for hospital beds, ICU beds and hospital beds, worse for hospital beds. We have the highest rate of fatal overdoses in the world for a sovereign nation. Scotland's a little ahead, but they're part of the United Kingdom. We have the fastest growing medical assistance in dying program, and I would argue the highest rate of sort of scandals within that program. So there's not a lot of countries that do legal euthanasia. But Canada has been easily emerged as the most mismanaged. So every chapter is just sort of, it didn't get a chapter if it was just a conventional bad thing. Like, oh, Canada ran up a lot of debt. Lots of countries ran up debt. Canada has kind of phoned in its military spending and its military readiness. That's fine. A lot of countries, particularly in Europe, have done that. But the 8 chapters are, if I could find an issue, housing affordability being another one. Worst price to income ratio for housing of anywhere in the world, and it's been that way for quite some time. So if something was not just bad, but historically bad, and also cited by other countries as an example of what not to do, which is sort of what inspired this book. But anyway, on the subject of Trudeau, so it's not tremendously political as a book in that sense. I only mentioned the name Trudeau about 3 or 4 times because in all of these trends, I mean, you can argue that Trudeau supercharged them, but in almost every sense, he took something that was already underway in Canada and just sort of, a lot of our problems existed before Trudeau came, and he just sort of worsened them. So I would see him as more of a symptom than an actual cause of this. So it would be much easier if we could just say, well, it's this one guy screwed everything up within 10 years. Things certainly did get worse, and everything that was bad got worse, and everything that was worse is catastrophically worse now, and everything that was good is now bad. I think with few exceptions, but we can't, unfortunately, we can't blame him for all those things, because when you look at a bad idea, what I tried to do with every chapter is say, well, there's a bad idea here. Where does this bad idea start? And
Mm-hmm.
almost always it starts before Justin Trudeau is prime minister.
Yep. Yeah, and like you mentioned, like we have the housing crisis and affordability issue, and also we have lack of enough like beds for patient in the hospital or ICU rooms. Despite we have all the resources or whatever you name it, we have them. But despite it, is it because of like what Pierre Pouliot called there is bureaucracy, or we have like failed politician, or I would say corrupt politician? It means they are not very well qualified to do their jobs. Who should be blamed particularly for all these issues?
I was trying to think of a grand unified theory. So, I get to the conclusion. I've written all these about, all of these different problems with Canada. And then I get to the end and I'm like, why did this hit us so hard? Because everybody's got, sort of gender identity. Lots of developed countries have thought of medical assistance in dying. Lots of them have looked at harm reduction. Lots of them have looked at identity politics. So why did Canada get hit harder than all of these other countries? And the sense I got was Canada, until very recently, was an extremely well managed country. So just 10 years ago, if you looked at what international headlines were saying about Canada, they would say we had the world's richest middle class. We had greater income mobility than the United States. So you could argue that the American dream, the idea of income mobility, if you work hard, you can get a good life for yourself. By statistics, that was more true in Canada than it was in the United States. So you had articles saying, the American dream is actually more true in Canada than it is in the United States. When you had countries who were facing a debt crisis, the gold standard on how to address a debt crisis was in the 1990s when Canada had a sovereign debt crisis. And debt crises are very hard to fix, but just sort of an across the board system of doing it very quickly, we're able to get it under control. Very similar to how Argentina now is sort of the model of, just very quick, effective economic management. The 2008 recession, Canada did better than almost anyone else. On immigration, even, occasionally you would see countries say, what does a good immigration system look like? And they would say, well, it's Canada. The points-based immigration system is the most effective in the world. You have a high immigration country that until very recently didn't really have a mainstream anti-immigrant sentiment, which is different than Australia, different than all of Europe, different than the United States. And it's just because it was well managed. So you had this very well managed country where everything generally worked and people had high trust in the system, higher trust than almost anywhere else. Even all the Scandinavian countries, Switzerland, all these places that are known for everybody looks the same and they all trust their government. Canadian trust in its institutions was even higher than those places. So what I think this did is that when bad ideas started to happen, Canadians had no defenses about them. We didn't have any capacity to think, well, maybe we should think twice about this. Maybe we should have checks against bad actors. Maybe I know this sounds nice, but we should imagine, an unintended consequence of how this could go. There was just none of that. So a lot of these bad policies were just passed with no criticism, no critique, no opposition. And as a result, it didn't have the checks that a more skeptical and normal country would have put in place. The great example being medical assistance in dying. When euthanasia programs were put in other countries, particularly in Europe and the United States, they were very careful about thinking of checks that would stop it from going too far. So across the United States, the rule is for the states that have legalized legal euthanasia, they only allow it if the person can self-administer. So they don't allow a doctor to kill the patient. You have to still be able to do it yourself. And that sort of gets rid of, if someone is unable to consent or for, whatever reason they're scared to do that. That single measure actually stops a lot of the sort of edge scandal cases from happening. Europe as well. In Australia, I think Australia, if a doctor recommends euthanasia, if they even bring it up, like, have you considered that? That's breaking the law. That's illegal to do. Canada, by contrast, we got ours because of a Supreme Court decision. And if you read that Supreme Court decision, the Supreme Court actually, because there was experts before the court saying you should be careful about pursuing a system of this kind because it could quickly go wrong. Opponents for it. And then the court in their decision says, we shouldn't lightly assume this is going to go wrong. It's just a one line in the court decision saying, no, this is Canada. We know what we're doing. We can put in a euthanasia system. Everybody's going to do their job and nobody's going to go too far. And as a result, we have a medical assistance and dying system with basically no checks at all. It is the most broad-based version. And the system has reacted as you would expect. There have been doctors within the system who have gone way too far. There have been people working with Veterans Affairs who have recommended to veterans with PTSD, yep, hey, have you considered MAID? Because there was just no checks in place. So it wouldn't have happened in a normal country because I guess they would have had the imagination, yep, to think that there was going to be crappy people screwing it up for them. So thus they would have had a more skeptical piece of legislation. And I found that almost everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You just have institutions, governments saying, it says anti-racism on the cover. How bad could this be? And then, it gets passed. And then, we're doing, land acknowledgements. And now we're putting racial quotas in terms of who we hire. I didn't see this coming at all. Maybe this wasn't so good.
Yeah. And you just like at the end you mentioned like a racial quota and like promoting uh, diversity, equity, inclusion, and we need to hire this much people. I know, like I mostly try to avoid such thing. I'm in favor of like like merit. But is it a new thing like since Trudeau took office these things happen or it happened in the past too in our
Yeah,
first
some of
time?
these are, some of these you can sort of attribute to Trudeau things, but some of them are sort of court decisions or other decisions that were already in place. So a lot of these, the wheels were already in motion. Trudeau didn't stop them, and sometimes he exacerbated them. But yeah, that is probably one of the more surprising things of the past few years, because when people see it, they don't think it's even legal in Canada. So they'll be applying for a government job, they'll be applying for a government grant, and they'll get to the part where
Yep.
They have to fill out, what's your race, what's your background, what's your race and background of everybody on your research team. Mm-hmm. And people are saying, this is Canada. You can't judge people by race. I mean, that's our whole deal here, is that we don't do this. And you have to explain to them, no, that is the law under federal law for certain positions. Like many academic positions that receive federal funding, due to a federal court decision, they have to have a certain racial quota. So this number of women, this number of sort of marginalized groups, this number of disabled people. And then initially, they just thought, okay, well, we'll just be careful about hiring people for these positions. If you couldn't do that organically, now within the past few years, you've started getting job advertisements, which are just openly saying, we're just looking for, your marginalized people, no men, or, Indigenous only. Yep. So that's only caught up as they weren't able to fill these positions organically. So, yes, this idea of sort of, and then you have seen anti-racism action plans, in police forces, municipal governments, provincial governments, federal governments. This is very much an American imported idea, in which the idea is the idea of anti-racism is that everything is racist. All our institutions are inherently racist. Any system that has unequal outcomes at the end. So if you have overrepresentation of any particular group in prison, it's because the prison is racist. If you don't have enough of a race represented in the bureaucracy, it's because there's something. But even if there isn't any overt prejudice in the bureaucracy, and there hasn't really been any overt prejudice in Canadian laws since the 1970s. I think that's kind of when we got rid of our first last laws to that extent. We used to have a whole bunch of them, but the overt prejudice was kind of gone 50 years ago. But the idea of anti-racism is that it doesn't matter what the law says. If it's yielding a system in which, one group is doing better than the others, that means the system itself somehow has to be racist, and you have to put in race-focused rules on the other end to sort of advantage certain groups. And you have group like in the book, the Canadian Armed Forces does this quite directly. They put out an anti-racism report, I think 3 years ago. Yep. And they said all of this explicitly. They said racism is the system in Canada. We serve, a biased, oppressive hierarchy. And as a result, until we reach a sort of equal nirvana, we have to advantage some groups over other groups explicitly.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of a new thing. So again, anti-racism also took over the U.S. by storm, but I would argue it hit us much harder because it came at a federal level and were slightly more centralized. And I would say it's much more pervasive here because we had no skepticism for it. Just any number of anti-racism action plans were passed at any number of levels. And often they didn't even get a press release. So people didn't know about this until they're getting a job application. They're like, what the hell is this? Why am I mentioning what race I am? And they're like, well, remember that plan that we brought in that nobody knows about, in which we now have, mandatory racial quotas. Anyway, you have to subscribe to those now. Anyway, the book, a lot of what I read in the book sounds like a Canada people don't think exists. Because a lot of it isn't getting, a tremendous amount of coverage. And it sounds crazy when I say it to you here in this podcast. That's why the book has an obnoxious number of endnotes, because I really didn't think people were going to believe me.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And is it all because of Canadians are too polite and too nice? Like these things are happening, like at your home, like people are calling you racist and you have no words to say them. If you say them, it means you will be charged.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, and you call it niceness, you call it politeness. But I think maybe that could factor into it. I mean, even now when I'm doing the interviews for the book, most radio stations that I appear on, someone is getting in touch with the radio stations that you should not be talking about this book. This is Canada. We are united. We're the greatest country in the world. And just even having at this moment of maximum peril with Trump trying to, we can't be criticizing the country. And I would argue that not criticizing the country and thinking you can't criticize the country is how we got into a lot of these problems. I mean, healthcare being a great example. I get this into the chapter. How often Canadians would just casually cite their healthcare as the greatest system in the world. I mean, the House of Commons, conservative, liberal, whoever, you just say our healthcare system is the greatest system in the world. So we just kind of got used to saying that. I'm sure I've said it most of my life. And as a result, you don't notice that maybe it isn't the greatest system in the world until you have a major health problem and you show up to the hospital and you're in the emergency room for 3 days and you suddenly can't get a doctor. So we've seen a lot of instances of that as the healthcare shortage has gotten really acute in the past 2 years. You've got people being surprised by how bad it is. And then often in media accounts where someone's like, I've been in the emergency room for 3 days, I'm on a waiting list for 2 years. They often express surprise that this is happening in Canada versus like, I don't know, Greece. If they run into government failure, you're like, oh, that makes sense that something isn't working in Greece. So, Canadians are so fixated on this idea that everything should, we would obviously have a justice system that deals out justice and, does the right thing. We would obviously have a healthcare system that is generous enough to sort of address the population. So it's very hard to sort of get your head around these ideas, which maybe used to be true, in which everything does work and we can trust the people in charge and they would never pursue bad ideas. And when the bad ideas start to fail, they just double down on the bad ideas. So I think, if anything, we're just spoiled by a country that did work. And we got so used to that being the norm, we forgot that if you don't manage it perfectly well, a lot of things can go wrong very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. Let's now. Come to discuss particularly about your book. Like, don't be Canada. How one country did everything wrong all at once. So, how did you come to this idea? Like, your title should be "Don't be Canada." What does it mean, and how did you come to this idea particularly?
The whole idea for the book was when I worked for the National Post, and I've worked there since 2011. So one of the things I do to try and think of story ideas is I always look how the international press is covering Canada. So I just do, Google News headline search, the word Canada, and I just check other countries, seeing what they're doing. And then when I started doing this, you would only ever see Canada mentioned either in some cutesy thing, like polar bear snuggles with Canada Goose or something. Or, like I mentioned, it would be citing Canada as an example of what to do. So, if you want, racial harmony, go to Canada. If you want good per capita income, go to Canada. And then it was really, the book was inspired by the fact that within the past few years, I really started to notice a lot of international media mentioning Canada as an example of what not to do. So you had BBC reports saying that uh, Vancouver is the fentanyl capital of the world. Toronto is now the auto theft capital of the world. Again, particularly on medical assistance in dying, that was across the spectrum. That was Jacobin magazine, very left wing, The Spectator, right wing in the UK, all of them saying, what Canada is doing on medical assistance in dying is just a perversion of everything that an assisted suicide regime should be. So it was me noticing that for the first time ever, people were sort of citing Canada as an example and as an example of what not to do, which is something I wasn't used to before. I always thought if we had some nutty thing on the books, there was always going to be some European country that had a nuttier version of it. And that's just not the case. We've gone further so far that even Europe on some of these issues is looking at us and thinking it's crazy. I mean, the good example being how far we've gone on harm reduction. So Europe sort of pioneered the idea of harm reduction. The term actually comes from the UK. But the idea of having low barrier safe consumption sites in basically every city, low barrier shelters with attached consumption sites. BC's experiment in safer supply. This is where you just supply free recreational opioids to drug addicts every single day. You don't monitor whether they're taking it. Stuff like this does not happen in the rest of the world, and certainly not at the scale that Canada has pursued them. So there's a few things like that where, again, I think the average Canadian would be surprised. We would assume someone would be doing what we're doing, but often we're way out there. We're outliers. And I don't think that's ever happened in our history before. I think we've been cautious enough on these issues that we didn't go well beyond what anybody else was doing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and are you targeting by writing or written this book to any political parties or any politicians? Is there anyone mentioned? As you said, like couple of times you mentioned Justin Trudeau, but are you targeting with this book any politicians or political party?
It'd be nice if everybody read it. Yeah, I wouldn't object to a circumstance in which this kind of had broad-based appeal. But I'll be honest, it's mostly sort of conservative politicians who are picking it up. Just by the fact of almost every issue I mentioned has gotten worse in the last 10 years, and he's usually been championed by either the Liberals or the NDP. So I can see why they would sort of resist the idea, but there's nothing. I didn't write it to be particularly partisan, and I wrote it from the perspective of if you had someone who wasn't completely dialed into these issues and didn't have hard opinions, and wasn't rah for one of the political parties, left wing, right wing, if they just read what was going on, they would probably be surprised and come around to the idea that these should be fixed. And most of what I bring up, there's not an immediate left-wing or right-wing solution to all of them. Maybe it's being seen as a left-wing or right-wing solution. But actually, the government of the BC NDP often comes up in criticizing the current state of Canada. They're mentioned multiple times. I would argue one of the most left-wing provincial governments in Canada. And they appear several times in the book saying, oh, we've got to deal with, we're letting way too many people out on bail. Or decriminalization, which they passed, but they've been on record saying, okay, decriminalization is one thing, but maybe we shouldn't smoke crack in parks and make that a charter right. I mean, my ideal is that you wouldn't, political parties from all stripes could come around to the idea that maybe unrestricted safer supply is a bad idea because the addicts just end up flipping the drugs into. So I think I provide the evidence there where you don't need a particular ideology to realize that these things are being managed poorly.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay, and like, would you say like each and every Canadian should read this book, or why should they read it if they do, if you would do?
I would do it just because I would say you can't make the country better unless you have sort of a good accounting of what is wrong with it. So when people ask me, how can you be a patriotic Canadian and write an entire book about how crappy your country is? And I'm saying, like, well, I wouldn't have written this book about Belgium. I have very low expectations for Belgium. I don't care. But I did it about Canada because I know this country has great potential. I think it has good shared values. All of these things that when you're looking at, you're gaming out what a successful, rich, prosperous, pluralist country would look like. Canada has all of them, probably better than anybody else in the world. And the fact that we're just utterly failing on almost every metric we were put to, that shouldn't be happening. So I think there's millions of Canadians right now who are sort of confused with what's happening because they've been in that 3-day emergency room wait line. They've noticed that a park near their house, which they played in, is now a tent city. They've noticed something wrong with the country and they maybe can't figure out what it is. I would urge them to read this book because it's overwhelming when you're just sort of saying, well, the country seems broken everywhere. At least at the end of this book, people have said it's depressing, but at the end, you can get your head around what is wrong. And once you start with that, then you can start fixing things. So I don't know. Just think of the country. Imagine the country just has a drug problem. It starts with admitting that you have a drug problem, and then your road to recovery can begin. So I think it's the most patriotic thing to be critical of your country, because otherwise you sort of lurch into a situation in which you're not a tremendously good country and you didn't see it coming because you didn't leave yourself open to the possibility that you could make mistakes.
And do you believe Canada is broken?
Oh, currently, yes. Yeah. This is very much a portrait of a country that is broken. So you can read it. Canadians can obviously read it and sort of figure out what's going on and appreciate what's going on. Because again, a lot of this stuff, it's surprising how little it's known among Canadians. I kept finding issues in this book that in other countries are big deals, massive scandals. So in the UK, here's one. There was a huge scandal over the fact that gender ID, a man could move into a women's prison simply by declaring themselves to be a woman. You just fill out a gender ID form. So they were looking to bring that in, and done with the best of intentions. They figure, well, if someone's transgender, we don't want to affirm that gender. But this was brought in, and it was just immediately exploited in the UK by, you have sex offenders who went into jail as a man, and they're like, well, if I can sign a form and suddenly be in an environment surrounded by vulnerable women, a women's prison, this sounds like an awesome idea. This was a huge scandal when it came in the UK. So I think the Scottish First Minister, there was a few other issues, but she had to resign partially over a scandal due to this. And when this was happening, I thought, Canada put in the exact same policy a few years ago with the exact same results. I would argue actually more results, because I think more offenders transferred into women's prisons with, reports of assaults, reports of intimidation, actual males going into women's prison.
Yep.
And just absolutely no grassroots mainstream objection to this at all. You'll see it among gender critical feminists, but you're just not seeing the sort of massive mainstream upswelling that you saw in the UK. Or I'll just see like horrifying murder cases. There's a case in Edmonton of a man with a long history of random attacks on people. He'd actually almost killed a guy several years before. He'd attacked random children, just very scary random stabbing attacks, and then just a couple of years ago, he's out on probation, and he just sets upon a completely random mother and child leaving school, stabs them to death, on the front yard of the school within an 8-year-old girl, a sister of one of the victims, saw the whole thing. So this is just a horrifying crime, extremely preventable. And I would think in a lot of countries, this level of crime would be so outrageous. You would have calls for immediate changes. You would have, you have a law named after the person. And this would be all that would be discussed in the federal parliament for weeks afterwards. And in Canada, it was just a blip. So I often hear the criticism, the United States can just endure mass shooting after mass shooting after mass shooting, and they don't change their gun laws. And like, oh, those heartless Americans, they love their guns so much they won't change their laws. And how many just horrific crimes can I see like that, committed by someone on bail, committed by someone on early release, where there was any number of checks to stop it. And you've got a mother and child being randomly stabbed to death in broad daylight outside a school where the entire school saw the killings. And again, there's just no mainstream. There's actually a source I quote in the book, and he's saying, again, with Canada's approach to medical assistance in dying, he's saying even in the Netherlands, the trusting Dutch, super liberal Dutch with a very similar medical assistance in dying system.
Wow.
Their scrutiny on the system is just so much higher than Canada. There was a miniature scandal about how much medical assistance in dying was being offered in cases, psychiatric cases. So this someone is getting made when the only underlying issue is mental illness. So I'd say probably the most controversial type of assisted suicide you can hand out. And as a result of this controversy, the Dutch government said, okay, we're releasing every single case of anyone in the Netherlands. We're going to remove the names. Every single case of a psychiatric person getting assisted suicide. So just incredible amounts of transparency because the public pressure was so great. I've just seen nothing like that in Canada. The only data we have for the fastest growing assisted suicide system in Canada with any number of mistakes is Health Canada puts out a survey 2 years after late numbers, and it's put up by the same agency whose job it is to push medical assistance in dying. So our transparency on the issue, on the numbers alone, is much lower than any other comparative jurisdiction. And I forget where I was going with this, but what was your question again?
So my question
You
was.
forgot as well. Okay.
I don't know. Like I was asking, like, is Canada broken? I think I asked you this
Oh,
question.
broken. Yes.
Yeah.
There we go. Yes, it's broken. But it doesn't mean when I say it's broken, and people say, well, how can you say it's broken? You can't fix it unless if you're in a car that's missing a wheel and it's scraping along the ground, it shouldn't be controversial to say, oh, by the way, I think the car would work a lot better if that we put a new wheel on the back. So yes, it is broken. But I say that with the caveat that I think we're able to fix our problems more. When I look at just the systemic problems faced by other countries, I really do see ours as more solvable than there's we have a housing crisis, but we have no shortage of land or trees or people able to build houses. Mm-hmm. So it's even that, which I think is our hardest problem to get out of, the one that would take the longest time with the most effort. Even then, there's no reason it can't be done.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so before I would go forward, I have a couple of questions, but as you said, like it should be 30 minutes, but it is over now almost 45 minutes. Do you want to continue or do you want to stop here?
Just delaying dinner. That's fine. I can not eat for the service of this.
So can we continue?
Sure, please. Yeah. Keep going.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. So like in your book, did you mention anything about like foreign interference and national media role?
I didn't really.
Yeah,
I didn't. That was another one of those things. So it had to get a chapter if it was sort of it was unusually bad for Canada. So maybe it will be, but I just, in terms of foreign interference as being a uniquely Canadian problem, I was able to find sort of enough examples of it happening in the United States. or Europe or other countries in which I couldn't say. The argument could be made that Canada was sort of worst at managing it, bad at managing it, but where foreign interference isn't sort of unique. And maybe you disagree, and I have to write a sequel. But no, I don't think it really came up. The theme is really that we screwed ourselves. I guess the biggest one would be the idea anti-racism is very much an American idea.
Yeah.
And when I'm looking at how anti-racism was applied to the Canadian system, I get into how dissonant it was with the Canadian experience. So often we would adopt American sort of anti-racism plans. For instance, anti-racism in the United States is drawn up very much around the issue of slavery. The idea that the United States has never overcome the legacy of slavery. And that's why all of these institutions, while not overtly racist, end up being racist because it all goes back to keeping Black people as second-class citizens in the aftermath of slavery. And a lot of those same ideas were applied directly to the Canadian system. And I point out there really is no legacy of slavery in Canada. And you'll even see this in government documents. They're saying, our legacy of slavery is exactly the same as the United States. And that's just wrong.
Yep.
There was slavery in Canada. We were part of the British Empire, so we abolished it 40 years before the United States. But this is a cold country. We don't do well with just large chattel plantations like you had in the States. So the estimate is over the entire course of the time when you had sort of legal chattel African slavery in Canada, we probably had a total of 4,000 slaves. So there's actually very few people in Canada who can say that they are a descendant of a Canadian slave. And usually when they are, they look like me. They'll say like, well, it's just like, I have a slave, I'm 1/32 or something, which is very different than the US. Most Black people in the United States, have a slave descendant, not too many generations away. So yeah, in terms of foreign interference, I would say Canada adopting the principles of anti-racism and not particularly caring that it didn't apply in the Canadian context. So again, when you're doing that, you're seeing this reflected in sort of outsized attention to the idea of Black overrepresentation in prisons, etc., which is based on the U.S. model and doesn't really make sense in the Canadian context. And while you're doing that, you're of course ignoring what would be a more prevalent issue of sort of racial dissonance would be Indigenous people. So you often see anti-racism materials.
Yep.
And I'd be like, if Canadian history, we were really worried for a lot of it about controlling Native people, and less worried about Black people because there wasn't really that many Black people around. And we also had we weren't too keen about the Chinese, and we in turn Japanese Canadian. So if you knew your history, know which people we oppressed and when.
Yep.
And if you just import American stuff, you're just sort of focusing on a legacy of slavery we don't have at the expense of all these other things that don't get mentioned.
Yeah, and also we have another issue in terms of media is being paid by government. Did you mention anything on your book? I don't know about.
There's sort of a censorship chapter. Yeah, there's an idea. There's areas in which I think the UK has probably pulled ahead of us. There's sort of edge cases in the UK where you're having police show up at someone's front door for a social media post. We haven't gone that far yet. I think we're on that track. If you sort of look at the underlying legislation, it all looks very similar to how it started in the UK. But I do sort of get into this idea that we used to have one of the most, we had a very liberal internet not too long ago. So very few internet controls in Canada, particularly as compared to Europe. And that has changed very dramatically. And that one you can actually pin on the current Liberal government. So just the fact that you go on Facebook and you can't read the news on Facebook, that was part of a law that was put in that said, well, Facebook, you can't carry news links unless you compensate the news agencies. And Facebook said, okay, we're just not going to carry news. Or I would argue the more egregious one was the Online Streaming Act. And it hasn't really entered into force yet, but this holds that it basically allows the government to decide what is and what is not Canadian content, which it already does on television and on the radio, but it extends that powers to the internet. So what you're getting is a situation in which YouTube will be compelled. The government will say, well, this is a Canadian video. This needs to be artificially brought up in your algorithm. This is not a Canadian video. This needs to be artificially sunk. And the rules for what that looks like are pretty crazy. So, you're sitting Canadian, sitting in front of a Canadian flag. It's a Canadian podcast. We're talking about Canadian things. If you were talking to an American for one episode, that is suddenly not Canadian content. It's, it doesn't hit the quotas, and you would have to do all this registration for it. You have to file all your information with the CRTC. If you're putting together a scripted video, you have to send in the citizenship of everyone who worked on it. A certain quota of them has to be. So just a crazy amount of red tape on online streaming, with the effect of, if it keeps going, one of these days you're going to turn on YouTube, it's going to suck. You're not going to know why it sucks. And it's because, we suddenly have the government uplifting all this so-called Canadian content and dropping all this other stuff.
Okay. Once again, thank you so much, Tristan, for your time and sharing about your book and answering my lots of questions. Hopefully, looking forward to seeing you again. And so, what's your message to Canadians? How they can get your book, and what should they expect more? Like whatever, if you did not share it yet, I did not ask you about your "Don't Be Canada."
So it's called Don't Be Canada. You can get it, actually sold out on Amazon. So people have been complaining to me that they have to wait 2 weeks for it to arrive. Now the ebook is available immediately, and I've been also asking. Apparently, a lot of visually impaired people are fans of mine. So a lot of people have been saying, "I can't see. Give me an audiobook." So we're gonna try and record an audiobook as soon as we can. But you can get it through Amazon, through Indigo, or straight from the publisher Sutherland House. And I've been told to tell people to leave a good review on Amazon. It helps the algorithm. But
Okay.
you can also read an excerpt on the National Post. The criminal justice chapter was excerpted in full in the National Post, so you could read that part for free. See if you want to get into it.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, Tristan, once again. And it was a great discussion with you, and wishing you very best on your book. And I don't know, like, whether I should ask you, like, can you please commit that you are appearing again here?
Oh, sure. Yeah, nothing happens to me. I've enjoyed this.
Yeah. Hopefully, yeah. See you again.
Mr. Parvez,
Yeah.
thanks for talking the book.
My pleasure, sir. Thank you very much, Mr. Hooper. And hopefully see you again, and wishing you very best. Always, whenever I get a time, I always read your past post on the National Post. You always talk about lot and enjoy whatever you tweet. Or now it
Oh,
is
thank you
called
very much.
X. My pleasure, sir.
Okay.
My pleasure.
All right,
Thank you.
bye.
Thank you. Yeah. Have a good night, sir. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.